gunshot rings out in an abandoned warehouse. A sergeant falls beside him, is a German shepherd, facing off against armed men, seemingly impossible. What happens next is not only heroic, but a true miracle. The story begins that night. The night sky was a restless canvas of rolling thunderclouds, unleashed by a torrential downpour that drenched every inch of the quiet city. Now and then, a flash of lightning illuminated the deserted streets, exposing fleeting glimpses of trash swirling in the gutters before plunging everything back into darkness. In the distance, a lone cat darted across an alley, startled by the thunder that rumbled overhead. Inside a parked patrol car on one of the more deserted avenues, Officer Carter Mitchell shifted uneasily in his seat, watching the windshield wipers battle against sheets of rain. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as he glanced at his partner, Luke, a sturdy German shepherd with keen eyes and a posture radiating alertness. A few blocks away, the distant hum of a speeding vehicle momentarily broke the silence, followed by squealing brakes. Carter tensed, considering whether to investigate. Moments later, the police radio crackled with a brief update about a minor disturbance across town, though it didn't seem urgent enough to draw them away. Still, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling lodged in his chest. The vacant street ahead was lit by flickering neon signs, their letters half burnt out, giving the scene an otherworldly glow. A homeless man emerged from behind a dumpster, peering into the damp night, but soon retreated when the thunder roared louder. Carter had answered countless calls during stormy nights, yet something about this one set his nerves on edge. It wasn't just the relentless downpour or the electric crackle of the storm. It was a gut feeling that something serious was about to happen. Luke seemed to sense it too. The dog kept his gaze fixed on the windshield, ears perked up, ready to move at the slightest sign of trouble. A brilliant flash of lightning revealed the tension in Carter's face, mirrored in the deep brown eyes of his canine partner. At precisely 0036, the crackling voice of the dispatcher filled the cruiser, overriding the steady drum of rain on the roof. Unit 12, we have reports of suspicious activity at the old warehouse on Oregon. Possible armed individuals inside. Proceed with caution. Backup is en route. The static-laced message ended, leaving a tense silence in its wake. For a brief moment, the radio hissed again, as if someone else at the station was about to speak, but it went quiet. Carter exchanged a concerned look with Luke, who let out a short, low whine. Carter exhaled slowly, steadying his nerves. "Looks like it's just us for now," he murmured, turning the key to fire up the engine. Before pulling away, he double-checked the side mirrors, mindful of the slick roads. The street behind them was empty, save for a flickering street lamp and the faint glow of headlights from a distant patrol car. He checked his sidearm, ensuring it was loaded and secure, then reached for the cruiser's overhead lights. As Carter eased the cruiser onto the main road, another call crackled over the radio, unrelated but urgent. A hit-and-run reported 2 blocks north. A momentary pang of guilt crept in. They could normally assist, but the dispatcher's tone made it clear the warehouse situation took precedence. The roads were nearly empty, save for a lone taxi speeding past, its windshield wipers flailing. Carter noted how the city's familiar bustle had dissolved into silence under the weight of the storm, heightening his sense of unease. The drive to Oregon was tense. Even with the lights on, visibility was poor, the downpour turning each street into a shimmering corridor of shifting shadows. Carter tightened his grip on the steering wheel as a gust of wind battered the cruiser, momentarily pushing it sideways. He heard the chatter of another unit, confirming they would arrive in approximately 10 minutes. It would still feel like an eternity if the suspects at the warehouse were indeed armed. At last, the imposing silhouette of the old warehouse came into view. A relic of a bygone era, it was a massive structure that once bustled with laborers, trucks, and freight. Now its rusted exterior stood as a monument to abandonment, broken windows and rotting beams testifying to years of neglect. A few tattered signs clung stubbornly to the chain-link fence around the property, warning no trespassing in faded letters. Carter parked a good distance away, switching off the lights to avoid drawing attention too soon. He stepped out into the relentless rain, water immediately soaked through his police uniform. Before moving on, he squinted at the dark horizon, half expecting to see silhouettes lurking behind the shattered windows. Nothing stirred, but the tension in the air was palpable. Luke jumped out of the police car, muzzle tilted to the sky as if testing the wind for any hint of danger. A distant lightning bolt illuminated the structure for a split second, revealing rust-eaten metal siding and flickers of movement from torn plastic sheeting that hung where doors once stood. The dog's ears pinned forward, and he let out a low growl. Carter crouched beside Luke, pressing a calming hand on the German Shepherd's flank. Though backup was on the way, in a situation like this, minutes could stretch out precariously. And as the storm raged on, Carter couldn't shake the feeling they were racing against more than just the rain. They were racing against something unseen, lurking within the warehouse's hollow depths. The couple headed towards the abandoned warehouse, every footstep splashing in puddles that had formed across the cracked concrete. In the distance, the wind howled, rattling a chain-link fence that stood half-toppled near the property's boundary. Dim light from a sporadic row of street lamps only partially illuminated the perimeter, leaving ominous stretches of darkness where Carter imagined anything, or anyone, could be hiding. He kept one hand on his holstered weapon, eyes scanning every corner for movement. Luke walked in sync beside him, muscles tense and ears alert, occasionally flicking them toward a sudden gust of wind or the distant clang of metal. "Stay close, Luke," Carter whispered, noticing how the dog's hackles raised momentarily in response to a fleeting shadow by the far wall. Luke responded with a low whine of acknowledgement. The warehouse's main entrance had a door hanging crookedly on broken hinges, groaning each time the storm-blown wind nudged it open. Above, a battered sign with chipped paint swung precariously, half attached to its rusted nails. A wave of stale air and the faint scent of mold greeted them as they slipped inside, the damp air pressing in on them like a warning. Inside the warehouse, water dripped from overhead rafters, creating a discordant rhythm against old metal barrels and cement floors. Somewhere off to the left, they heard the distinct scuttling of rodents knocking over debris. The silence otherwise felt almost claustrophobic, broken only by the occasional echo of dripping water that amplified the building's emptiness. Carter flicked on his flashlight. Its narrow beam cut through the gloom, illuminating stacks of pallets and crates scattered haphazardly around the cavernous interior. Luke sniffed at the ground, nose sweeping from side to side. At one point, he halted and let out a low growl, staring intently at a cluster of crates. Carter paused, breath catching in his throat, only to realize it was a stray cat darting behind the boxes. Relieved but still tense, he continued forward, shining the beam across a line of rusted machinery that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The sense of unease was palpable, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And Carter felt the weight of each drop of water echoing through the oppressive dark. The moment felt suspended in time, as though the entire warehouse inhaled and held its breath. Then, with a sudden crack that reverberated off the concrete walls, a gunshot shattered the silence. It was so loud in the enclosed space that it set Carter's ears ringing, momentarily disorienting him. He instinctively reached for his weapon, but his reflexes came an instant too late. A fiery pain burned through his left side, knocking him off balance. He staggered against a nearby stack of wooden pallets, his flashlight clattering to the floor and rolling away, its narrow beam now flickering wildly against the dripping metal barrels. Carter pressed a trembling hand to his wound, his fingers coming away warm and slick with blood. His heart pounded in his ears, and the world around him seemed to tilt and spin, darkness edging into his vision. The stale air mixed with the pungent smell of gunpowder as he tried to focus, attempted to steady his breathing, but his lungs felt constricted, panic threatening to choke him. Luke reacted at once. The dog let out a sharp, furious bark, then crouched low, scanning the darkness for the shooter. In the distance, Carter could hear the echoing clang of a metal barrel being knocked over, a frantic shuffle of footsteps, signs that someone was on the move. Carter struggled to keep his footing, but his legs gave way, sending him crumpling onto the wet floor, where each droplet of water amplified his ragged gasps for air. From somewhere deeper in the gloom, hushed voices emerged, overlapping in tense whispers. It was impossible to tell how many people lurked there, but the urgency and fear in their tones was unmistakable. Another sharp thud echoed, like a crate being shoved aside. Luke placed himself protectively between Carter and the unknown assailants, growling with a guttural intensity that resonated through the vast space. Lightning from outside briefly illuminated the interior, revealing nothing but shifting shadows and glimmers of movement. In that fleeting light, Carter caught sight of Luke's bared teeth, a silent pledge that the K-9 would defend him at all costs, even if more shots were fired. "Do you think the police backup will arrive in time to rescue Carter? Comment to hope they will be rescued." As if summoned by the dog's defiance, 3 silhouettes slipped out of the shadows, their hurried movements betraying nervous energy. The faint beams of Carter's fallen flashlight revealed men in dark clothing, one with a pistol still aimed in their direction. Another, sporting a ragged baseball cap, spat a curse under his breath. "Grab the cop," he growled, glancing anxiously at his cohorts. "Before..." He never got to finish. A distant wail of sirens cut through the storm, echoing against the warehouse walls. The men exchanged frantic looks, the leader cursing again. "We don't have time," one muttered, voice tight with urgency. A loud clang echoed as one suspect accidentally kicked an empty barrel, causing them all to tense. Then, without a backward glance, they darted away, their footsteps pounding across the slick concrete until they vanished into the darkness. In their haste, they knocked over a crate of metal tools that clattered across the floor, the din lingering in the silence they left behind. Carter's vision blurred, and he felt warm blood seeping through his shirt, each breath sending a fresh jolt of pain through his ribs. Fighting dizziness, he tried to lift his head to see where the men had fled, but the warehouse lights blurred into shifting halos. Luke remained rooted by his side, teeth bared, letting out a low, menacing snarl that reverberated in the cavernous space. From deeper inside, the only response was the drip of water and the distant hum of the storm raging outside. Moments later, a flurry of motion at the warehouse entrance signaled the arrival of backup. The glow of approaching flashlight beams spilled across the broken doorway, accompanied by urgent shouts of, "Police, show yourselves!" A cluster of uniformed officers rushed in, weapons drawn, scanning the area for threats. Close behind them came 2 paramedics in bright jackets, maneuvering through the scattered debris to reach Carter. One officer slipped on a puddle but caught himself, cursing under his breath as he waved for more light. "Officer down!" someone barked into a radio, voice taut with concern. Carter fought to stay conscious, pressing a shaky hand against the wound as deft hands applied gauze and pressure. A paramedic's worried face hovered above him, brown eyes full of focus. "He's losing blood fast," she called to her partner, adjusting the medical kit strapped across her shoulders. Nearby, another officer knelt to pick up Carter's discarded flashlight, shining it around to make sure no threat remained, lurking behind the crates. As they maneuvered Carter onto a stretcher, Luke whined and nudged at his partner's motionless hand, refusing to leave his side. Rain dripped from Luke's fur, creating a small puddle on the floor. Outside, the sirens grew louder, and the chaotic spray of flashing red and blue lights illuminated the loading dock. The dog stood there in the downpour, fur slick with rain, as though waiting for any sign that his wounded partner would be all right. Meanwhile, the officers regrouped, shining lights into the recesses of the warehouse, determined to find the gunman, or gunmen, who had vanished moments before. The warehouse still dripped with tension and rainwater, puddles forming around rusted machinery and broken pallets. Several officers fanned out, flashlights sweeping across the concrete floor as they searched for the suspects who had fled moments before. The dim overhead lights flickered sporadically, casting shifting shadows that danced across half-collapsed shelving units. One of the officers, Frank, took hold of Luke's lead, though the German Shepherd seemed more determined than ever to keep moving, his body taut with urgency. The dog glanced at Frank, then at the dark recesses of the warehouse, as if urging the officer to hurry. Suddenly, an urgent bark echoed off the walls, momentarily overpowering the steady drip of rain through the warehouse roof. Luke had detected something. His nose flared, and he tugged at the leash, leading Frank around a toppled metal barrel that rattled when nudged. Together, they crept toward a shadowy corner stacked high with crates. Despite the water collecting around them, Luke sniffed intently along the ground, ignoring the puddles forming beneath the leaking holes above. Meanwhile, other officers converged behind them, keeping a cautious distance. A muffled scuffing sound came from behind a stack of wooden boxes. Frank raised a clenched fist, signaling the others to hold their positions. Luke's hackles rose, and he barked again, sharper this time, as if warning whatever lurked out of sight. The officers responded by spreading into a semicircle around the crates, their flashlights cutting through the dimness. At that moment, a figure burst out, toppling a few of the crates as he lunged toward an emergency exit. Water splashed at his feet as he sprinted, but one of the officers anticipated the move and tackled him hard, sending both sliding across the slick floor. Twisting and cursing, the suspect still couldn't break free before an officer pinned him, wrestling his wrists into handcuffs. Panting and glaring, the man sneered at Frank and the rest, refusing to answer any questions. With that suspect in custody, Luke wasn't done. The German Shepherd sniffed the air again, tail stiff and ears perked. He pulled Frank farther into the warehouse, weaving between metal barrels and forklift machines left to rust in silent testimony to a bygone era of busy shipments. Water dripped from overhead walkways, forming a constant chorus of plinks and splashes. Then came a sudden noise from above, a scrape of metal on metal. "Look out!" an officer shouted, shining his flashlight toward the rafters. On a catwalk hanging precariously by rusted bolts, a second suspect was silhouetted against the faint glow of lightning outside. The figure, perched up on a steel beam, tried to flatten himself against the support to avoid detection, but the flashlights found him. Luke barked again, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. For several tense minutes, the officers negotiated with the suspect. They ordered him down at gunpoint, voices echoing through the darkness. The man, desperate, seemed to consider leaping to another beam, but the slick metal and the threat of a long fall made him hesitate. Eventually, he complied, arms raised in surrender as he inched along the beam toward the narrow catwalk ladder. Under the watchful gaze of 4 armed officers and 1 relentless K9, the suspect climbed down, trembling as he was handcuffed on the spot. The warehouse fell silent once more, save for the soft drip of rainwater and the sound of Luke's panting, his keen eyes scanning for any more signs of danger. Once the second suspect was secured, the group conducted a methodical sweep of the warehouse, moving in small teams to clear each sector. Broken pallets and abandoned machinery, lay scattered like obstacles in a maze, and the officers used hand signals to communicate as they inched deeper into the gloom. Luke, muzzle low to the ground, guided them to the heart of the structure, where they discovered a large, rusted metal container pushed against a crumbling brick wall. Its lid hung partly ajar, revealing a dark interior. One of the officers pried the container open a bit more, only to reel back in alarm at the chilling discovery inside: sticks of dynamite, wires coiled haphazardly, and an assortment of parts that looked like improvised explosive devices. A hush fell over the team as each officer shone flashlights over the grim find. Their radios buzzed with anxious chatter, a backdrop to the relentless drip of rainwater from the sagging rafters above. "This is bigger than a simple break-in," Frank muttered, carefully angling his flashlight so as not to disturb any triggers. They were planning something catastrophic. He pressed his radio to his lips and urgently requested the bomb squad. Even the hum of distant thunder felt ominous now, as if underscoring the severity of the situation. Luke stood by, occasionally letting out a low growl, as though he sensed the danger wasn't over. A few officers glanced at the German Shepherd, trusting his instincts in the same way they'd trust any seasoned partner. The entire warehouse seemed to hold its breath, the silence broken only by the squawk of radios coordinating new arrivals, bomb technicians, additional backup, and crime scene investigators. In the midst of this tense lull, the final suspect made his move. He had been hiding behind a toppled forklift, waiting for a chance to escape or strike. As two officers converged on a corner of the room, the man lunged from the shadows, brandishing a rusted crowbar. Luke, ever vigilant, whipped around with a fierce bark, giving the officers just enough warning to dodge the crowbar's arc. One officer stumbled, but his partner swiftly tackled the suspect, disarming and pinning him to the ground amid scattered debris. The suspect spat curses, but his ambush had been thwarted by Luke's keen senses and swift reaction. After the third man is captured, the team discovers that the explosives were not only packed together, but also attached with a timer, evidence of a more sophisticated plan. This was no small-scale operation. It hinted at a larger network or plot. Carter's shooting, which had kicked off the night's events, now felt like just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. The officers worked carefully to bag evidence, photograph the scene, and begin the delicate process of removing the volatile materials. Through it all, Luke's unwavering focus never faltered. His intense stare and poised stance suggested he understood just how grave the stakes truly were. Hours later, under the harsh glare of flickering fluorescent lights in a cramped police interrogation room, one of the apprehended suspects finally broke his silence. His face was bruised, a trail of dried blood at the corner of his mouth from where he'd struggled during the arrest. Yet he wore a crooked grin through split lips, eyes flicking with dangerous amusement. "You have no idea what's coming," he taunted, leaning forward as far as his handcuffed wrists would allow. "This was just the beginning," he hissed, his words dripping with malice. "You won't stop what's coming." An uneasy silence filled the room. Officer Frank and two other detectives exchanged tense glances. Even the ticking wall clock seemed to grow louder in that moment. One detective pressed the suspect for more details, slamming a folder of confiscated documents onto the metal table. Another turned away, scribbling observations on a notepad. But the suspect merely offered a twisted chuckle, throwing out cryptic hints about a next phase and more pieces in play. He refused to reveal specifics, only hinting at a broader operation lurking just beyond their grasp. Eventually, the interrogators managed to pry loose enough fragmented information, references to shipping manifests, coded receipts, and overheard threats, to form a picture of something larger. It was Officer Frank who first made the connection, circling a location on an evidence map. All clues pointed toward an abandoned shipping port on the outskirts of town, rumored to have poorly monitored docks and dilapidated storage facilities. A perfect place, they realized, for unloading contraband or orchestrating a multi-phase attack. Despite the late hour, long past midnight, with dawn only a few hours away, the team knew the clock was ticking. The suspect's smug demeanor made it clear he believed they were already behind. Frank stood, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the fatigue. "We don't have time to rest," he said grimly. Radios were snatched up, calls made, and within minutes they mobilized additional units as well as specialized bomb squads, coordinating across departments to prepare for the next move. As they cleared out of the interrogation room, the suspect's laughter followed them, echoing ominously down the corridor, a haunting reminder of the threat that still loomed beyond the city's sleeping streets. Slivers of dawn began piercing the horizon by the time the convoy of police vehicles arrived at the abandoned port. A few stray gulls circled overhead, their calls barely audible above the distant hum of industrial machinery left to rust. The storm had subsided to a drizzle, casting a cold, damp mist over the labyrinth of shipping containers stacked 3 or 4 high. Rusty cranes loomed above like silent sentinels from a bygone industrial age, their skeletal frames dripping with condensation. In the dim morning light, broken crates and scattered debris created treacherous footing on the wet concrete. Luke led the way once again, nose to the ground, weaving through narrow alleyways formed by rows of massive steel containers. The team advanced cautiously, guns drawn, flashlights cutting through the gray haze. At first, the place seemed deserted, no signs of movement or life, but the eerie stillness only heightened their vigilance. Suddenly, Luke stiffened near a cluster of oversized freight containers, hackles rising as he let out a low, insistent bark. Reacting to Luke's signal, Frank motioned for the bomb squad to move in, each member scanning the perimeter for possible booby traps. One officer pried open a container door, rusted hinges screeching in protest, revealing an unsettling sight. More explosives and suspicious crates stamped with foreign markings. "These aren't just random," muttered a bomb squad technician, carefully examining the device's wiring. "This has the hallmarks of a coordinated terror plot." An uneasy murmur went through the officers, some exchanging worried glances as they relayed urgent updates over their radios. Suddenly, a clatter of footsteps echoed behind the containers, jarring them into action. The officers spun around, flashlights and weapons poised. A group of 3 suspects, presumably readying to move the cargo, locked eyes with the police and scattered in different directions. One suspect kicked over a metal drum in his haste, sending it clanging down an aisle between containers. Luke bolted toward the nearest suspect, barking furiously to halt him. Panicked, the man tried to scramble over a chain-link fence, but was swiftly intercepted by officers waiting on the other side. As they shoved him to the ground and handcuffed him, Luke tore off after the second suspect, who sprinted across the yard in a desperate bid for freedom. Meanwhile, the third suspect hopped into a nearby truck, gunning the engine as mud sprayed beneath the spinning tires. Officer Frank, still trailing behind Luke, shouted, "Stop! Police!" The truck roared to life, lurching forward in the slippery muck. Without hesitation, Luke dashed to the driver's side. The suspect tried to slam the door shut, but Luke lunged, knocking the man off balance and forcing him to drop the keys onto the sodden floor mat. The engine sputtered and stalled. Within seconds, officers converged, wrenching the suspect out of the cab and forcing him face first into the wet ground. Heart pounding, Frank caught up and helped secure the final suspect. The shipping port fell eerily silent, save for the labored breathing of exhausted officers and the sporadic barking of police dogs echoing through the rows of containers. A quick sweep of the truck revealed a hidden compartment stuffed with additional contraband, likely more explosives or weapons intended for transport. It was clear these criminals had planned to distribute deadly materials elsewhere, possibly launching multiple attacks across the region. With the final suspects in custody, the immediate threat was neutralized. Bomb squad technicians carefully dismantled the explosives discovered in the container. Their lights and gear shone bright against the early morning gloom, highlighting the scale of what had almost transpired. The combined efforts of the police had prevented a potential catastrophe from unfolding in their city. Back at the station, word of Luke's heroism spread quickly. From saving Carter in the warehouse to chasing down suspects at the shipping port, the German Shepherd had proved indispensable at every turn. The K9's sharp instincts and unwavering loyalty had not only saved his partner's life, but had also been crucial in thwarting an elaborate criminal plot. Officer Frank, still catching his breath, offered Luke a grateful pat on the head. "You did good," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Carter's gonna be proud." Meanwhile, news from the hospital was cautiously optimistic. Carter Mitchell, though gravely injured, had pulled through surgery. The bullet had done significant damage, but quick medical intervention had likely saved his life. When he finally regained consciousness, the first thing he asked about was Luke. A few days later, Carter was stable enough to have visitors. Frank brought Luke to the hospital room, where Carter lay propped up on pillows, bandages wrapped around his midsection. The moment Luke entered, his tail wagged furiously, and a soft whine escaped his throat. Carter smiled, his eyes misting. He extended a hand which Luke immediately licked. In the days that followed, local news stations ran stories about the hero K9. Footage showed Luke guiding officers through the warehouse, cornering suspects at the port, and standing guard over Carter. The city's mayor praised the police department's swift action and presented Luke with an honorary medal for bravery. Even the usually stoic bomb squad officers broke into smiles when talking about how crucial Luke's role had been. The operation had exposed a network of criminals intent on orchestrating large-scale terror. With multiple arrests made and a cache of explosives confiscated, the department had a mountain of evidence to process. Interrogations continued, and more suspects were identified, but the linchpin of the entire investigation remained the night Carter and Luke first arrived at the warehouse. That was the catalyst that uncovered the entire conspiracy. The story has touched the hearts of many people in the city. If it touches your heart, please comment your feelings and share the city you are listening to this story.